Good evening, everybody. Welcome to the AHDB Oil Cereals and Oilseeds January webinar. My name is Richard Meredith. I am the regional manager for the West of England and Wales, and I'll be chairing this webinar this evening. Just to run through a couple of housekeeping points. You're all muted, so we can't hear what you're saying, so don't panic. But if you do want to make any comments or questions as we go through this webinar, there is a questions box on the right-hand side of your screen. Although you're not with us tonight, we encourage interaction and questions as we go through. I can see these questions and I can pass them on to our speakers. We're aiming 7 o'clock now, and we're aiming to conclude by 8 o'clock. Bearing in mind that we'll probably be speaking for about 45 minutes, and then we'll have a formal questions period at the end. If you're BASIS or Noroso registered, please feel free to put your name, date of birth, and the registration number in the comments box, and I shall complete the form and send them off tomorrow for you. This webinar will be recorded, so if you want to watch any of it afterwards, repeat any of the slides, please go to the AHDB Cereals and Oilseeds YouTube site. It should be up in the next few days. Any questions or queries on how to do that, please let me know and I can send you the link. Finally, before I introduce tonight's speakers, the next webinar is the 27th of February. At the same time of 7 o'clock. This is with somebody called Heather Wildman. Heather is going to be focusing on staff recruitment, motivation, and retention. Should be an exciting webinar, but obviously, if you've received the invite to this one, then you should receive all the information for that. Great. So to pass you over to our speakers tonight, I'm joined by Jonathan Blake and Mark Wood. Jonathan is a principal research scientist at ADAS and based at Rosemont. We're currently sat in Jonathan's office at home because he had the best internet out of all of us. And opposite me also is Mark Wood. Mark is the now retired farm manager, now retired monitor farmer at the Hereford Monitor Farm. Mark's going to cover a bit about his background in a moment, but the whole point of this evening was kind of linking the research and the practice and how Mark's implementing it, and Jonathan's going to be describing how he thinks best to design a fungicide program this spring. Anyway, I won't bore you anymore with my antics. I'm going to pass it over to Mark Wood. As I mentioned earlier, if you've got any questions as we go through, please type them in the box. Where possible, I'll pass them on to the speakers. Thank you, gentlemen, and Mark, over to you.
Thank you very much, Richard. Good evening, everybody. Not being as famous as Mr. Blake, I thought a few words about my background would help. I'm farm manager at JPF Clay Farms. I've been working there for 14.5 years. Currently farming 2,800 acres arable and beef in the Wye Valley in Herefordshire. I've just retired as a farm manager by the sounds of it, but I've also retired as the Hereford Monitor Farm, handing over to Martin Williams and Russell Price, which is very good. Our soils are 2/3 sandy loam, 1/3 clay loam. Crops are feed wheat, oilseed rape, oats, winter barley to try and spread the rotation, and beans or peas, depending on whether it's light or heavy ground. Our average field size is 12 acres with quite a large variation in soil type within each field. The agronomy is done in-house with the help of Andrew Goodinson, who comes and helps me out and gives me some backup. So moving on to tonight's subject, planning a fungicide strategy. Neither myself or Jonathan are going to try and tell you exactly what to spray, what product, at what time. Every situation is different. We want to try and get you thinking about what is behind your decisions and how to make improvements and possibly either save money or spend the money better. First of all, I think it's key that you know the diseases that are important to you. You know your farms better than everybody, and in conjunction with your agronomist, you'll know what your main diseases are. Completely different or slightly different whether you're in the east, west, south, north of the country. But I would argue that the most important disease to all of us is Septoria. Yellow rust, brown rust, mildew, all of these diseases can be controlled with an appropriate strategy. Yet you will get Septoria. Everybody, whether you're in the west or the east, will get Septoria. And I'd just like to demonstrate that with the graph, which was kindly given to me by Gareth Bubb. It shows the crops respected by agronomists, growth stage 73 to 75, and they were looking for what diseases were present. They weren't looking at how much, but just if the disease was present. First of all, Septoria. On average, across the years, 80% of crops had Septoria in them at growth stage 73. Mildew was about 20%. Tan spot, a disease which a lot of us can't spot very easily, not the easiest one to spot, was down around 10%. With yellow rust, a lot of press coverage on that, which everybody gets very excited about. It's down around 5% average in the crops. Brown rust, to finish with, can be quite devastating late in the season, around 7%. I'm not saying that other diseases are not important, but with good planning, they are controllable. Septoria can't be eradicated, so needs some very careful thought. So how do we go about that? I see chemicals as the final part of the jigsaw. It's protecting the decisions you've made earlier in the season. More and more, you can't just rely on chemicals to get you out of jail, so we need a bit more of a bigger plan. Starts with your rotation. Is it a first wheat you're growing, second wheat, second cereal? What are the problems? Take all and bunts we're not really going to cover tonight, but these can be covered by seed dressings and changing drilling dates and T-naughts. Also, with the move to direct drilling, you've got the issues of green bridge. Is there going to be a transfer of disease in the stubble? One of the real big ones is the variety you choose. You know your disease aims, and in conjunction with the recommended list published by AHDB, there's some really good information in there, so as you don't make a rod for your own back, sowing a variety that's not really appropriate for you. As an example, if you're in the east, growing reflection with its rather entertaining yellow rust rating would be causing a recipe for disaster. Don't grow varieties that are going to cause you additional problems. There's some really good information in the recommended list, and it's funded by your levies, so make sure you use it. Moving on to drilling date. It has a large effect on disease ratings, especially on Septoria. Ratings given in the recommended list are based on October drillings. If you're drilling in September, you're not going to get the same sort of resistance, especially to Septoria, and I would suggest that you remove 1 point for every week into September that you're drilling. This would give Graham, it's quoted at 6.7 rating against Septoria, drilled in the second week of September, a score of about 5. Santiago, quoted at 4.3 for normal drilling. If you drilled that in early September, you'll be looking at a rating of about 2. If drilling early, I'd encourage you to use higher rating varieties, but treat them with that rating being decreased by the earlier drilling. Moving on to seed rates. Everybody knows that big, thick crops equals lots of disease. If you're not tackling blackgrass and trying to grow a big crop for competition, I would suggest you manage your seed rates. Try and grow towards a canopy growth when you need it, rather than encouraging disease all the way through. Timing of sprays. To get the best out of any product, any chemical that you are using, you need to hit the right spray timing. It's absolutely critical. If you can't cover your ground at the appropriate times, you might need a completely different spray strategy.
It's an interesting point you raised, Mark, about treating fungicides as the last point of the last part of the jigsaw. But I think it's actually quite an important part as well. And I just wanted to touch on that whilst we look at the yield responses that we see across the AHDB variety trials. Each bar here represents the yield, both treated and untreated, within an individual season. Yellow representing the untreated, and the green the yield response to fungicides. And it's quite noticeable just how much yield response to fungicides varies from one season to the next. And I think that seasonal factor is a key element in how much yield response and how much disease we're likely to see. If we look at 2010, yield responses were about 1/4 of a tonne across all the varieties in the RL on average, which really means your average fungicide program was probably overkill in those circumstances. In more recent years, where yellow rust has been more of a concern as well, yield response has been much bigger than that. And in 2017, the average yield response across all the RL varieties at the 7 or 8 sites they have where they monitor treated and untreated yield was near a 3.5 or 3.3 tons per hectare, which is quite large. And that was undoubtedly driven to a degree by diseases that are more easily controllable, such as yellow rust that Mark touched on earlier. But underlying that will be Septoria, and Septoria probably wasn't the worst year last year for Septoria, but it certainly was in there. And I think actually further east and further north, it was perhaps a bigger problem than it was usually here in Herefordshire. But what I wanted to do really was to take a step backwards for a moment and consider, when do we apply fungicides and why? We could all rush out there now and go and put fungicides. Well, probably couldn't, because you wouldn't get to travel. But if you were to go out in early spring and put fungicides on your wheat crop, you wouldn't probably make any difference to yield. And that's primarily because wheat, it's fair to say, is really quite widely agreed. It's driven by light interception during grain filling. It's primarily considered as a source limited crop, a crop that's limited by light interception from growth stage 65, flowering through to the end of the season. And with that in mind, protecting the canopy during that key period is what it's all about. And if we look at how light is intercepted during that period, well, it can be broken down by the leaves and the components of the crop that catch that light. And these are the leaves that we have to protect the most. The flag leaf clearly is the most important leaf that we have. It accounts for 40 to 50% of light interception during that key period. And that just highlights the importance of our T2 timings at growth stage 39, where we're looking to apply just at that point of leaf emergence, full leaf emergence of the flag. When we look at other leaves, leaf 2 accounts for nearer 20 to 25%, and leaf 3, well, it's actually not that important. It's perhaps closer to 10% of light interception during grain filling. So although we might perceive quite a lot of importance on that early T1 timing, it's probably not quite so much to protect leaf 3, but to slow disease development further up the canopy. One factor within this is, and we're often asked this question, is how does canopy size affect that contribution by leaf layer? And I just wanted to touch on that next, actually, and look at how light interception does vary with canopy size. A lot of people, a lot of the perceived wisdom on this is that if we have smaller crops, we have more dependence on lower leaves within that crop. And I think that's reasonably true. If you look at the banana that's represented by leaf 2, leaf 3, and leaf 4, it does widen out a bit when the canopy size drops below the optimum point of 6 down to 5 or 4. It looks a little bit wider. And yes, I think the wedge that shows flag leaf light interception here clearly indicates that the importance of the flag leaf probably does increase a bit as we get larger canopies. That said, if we were to design a fungicide program entirely around our flag leaf in a large canopy, we'd probably be going down a dangerous route, because that larger canopy will be a more conducive environment for disease, and it will be much more difficult to target disease on those low leaves, so there'd be a chance of infection spreading up. But I think one aspect I wanted to touch on here, there's been a lot of talk within the YEN about how we can maximize yield. The YEN is the Yield Enhancement Network, and it's been looking at a whole range of crops growing across the country for maximum yield. And one of the two factors really they've been pulling out of the research, or the sites, I should say. One is that canopy size seems to be associated with high yield, but also canopy longevity, and those two factors both seem to be linked to the highest yielding crops. And I think of the two, I would more on the side of canopy duration than canopy size if I were looking to maximize my yield, because canopy size, the optimum canopy size varies by season. If you're in a season with a very sunny days through June and July and very cool nights, then that situation will favor a large canopy where you have high light intensity, you get more light capture in that slightly larger crop. And so the sugars and photostimulates you'll get will outweigh any negative effect of a canopy size that's larger and will respire more. And under cooler conditions, it will respire less at night. So those cool nights and sunny days are perfect for a large canopy. And I think we've had a couple of seasons that probably have favored those large canopies. But if you remember back to 2012, we had a season very different to that, where we had a very dull June and warm nights. And under those conditions, we can find the increase in canopy size can have a negative effect. You don't catch much more light because it's dull, and that larger canopy can respire more. So actually your respiration can outweigh the net benefit that you're getting from the additional sugars. And so under those conditions, we might actually find a smaller canopy is best. So I think on balance, we don't know what light interception we're going to get through June and July when we set up our canopy. So it's probably to target an optimum canopy size of around 6, which has been long considered the optimum. It's probably a reasonably safe way to go, because if you don't, well, this is what we could end up with. We could end up with crops that are very flat. This is one of the practical considerations that come with targeting large canopy sizes. And certainly that's not where any of us want to be, and that'll have a much bigger effect on yield than any suboptimal disease program can ever have. So anyway, just a little bit more on that and how we target our T1 and T2 applications. So we're thinking about how we protect these upper 3 leaves. And this chart just shows the disease control that we get from on leaf 3, leaf 2, and leaf 1 from different timed applications. And it's no coincidence that leaf 3 being the lower of these, we get the highest, or the highest amount of disease control when the spray is applied just after that leaf has emerged. And the peak of each of these charts is actually at that roughly that point at which leaf 3, leaf 2, and leaf 1 has emerged. And that would be one strategy you could adopt in your disease control program. You could just spray each of those top 3 leaves as it emerges. Practically, that's not always very easy. Sprayers have a lot of other things to do, as I'm sure Mark will come on to in a moment. But for Septoria, we don't actually think that's necessary, because if we time our T1 leaf 3 application well, at leaf 3 emerged, leaf 2 will be emerging, and we will usually get very good control on leaf 3, but we'll also get 50–60% control on leaf 2 as well. We can then come back 3 weeks, 4 weeks later at flag leaf emerged, and at that point, optimal for flag leaf sprays, we'll also get 30 or 40% control on that lower leaf, controlling that latent infection. Now that works very well for Septoria. I think it's probably less good when you're looking at yellow rust. A shorter latent period in yellow rust situations can mean that that's a little less optimal. We've got a question coming in.
Yeah, sorry, I'm going to interrupt there, Jonathan. I've got a question. I've got a couple of questions on the floor just as we go through. The first one is very small flag leaves compared to leaf 2 and leaf 3 on Skyfall last year. Did this affect the leaf importance in 2017?
Yes, it could well have, because if you have a smaller leaf, I mean, any season can throw differences out there, and dry conditions at any given point can affect the size of a given leaf. And yes, it will vary by variety, and it will vary by season. So yes, actually, the figures we have are averages, but yes, it can vary widely either side of that.
And the other question I have, Jonathan, is with the lack of eradicant activity now in triazoles, should we target leaf 2 specifically at T1.5?
Should we? Well, it's a good question. I mean, we don't have as much curative activity from the azoles. We're probably more reliant on the curative activity of the SDHIs at T2 now. And I think generally we would say that we're still getting enough curative activity from the SDHIs and azoles combined to be able to effectively protect that leaf too.
So, looking at some thoughts for 2018 strategy. I'm guessing most of you already drilled. We're here in January, so apart from if you're drilling after some very late sugar beet or something like that, most of the winter wheats are in. So you know your variety and you know that drilling date. So you know what you're faced with for the coming season. If you have planted Santiago in September, you know exactly what you're doing and you know you've got some problems. So I'd suggest talk to your agronomist. Agronomists are all going around the conferences and the board and probably want to have a chat to a couple of farmers and what have you. So get that conversation going early when they've got the time, when the pressure of the season isn't on, and it's really good to start with that. I would start the planning with the higher disease situations, whether that's down to a weaker variety, a very thick crop, early drilling, and what have you. And then the rest of the strategy for the season will fall into place, I feel. I always find it very useful to set a budget, not as a strict budget. You're not going to say, I'm going to spend X, Y, and Z, but if you give yourself a guide, it gives yourself and your agronomist some parameters to work to. You can budget, which is always very good, but it gives you something to aim for. And then as through the season, you can decide to spend slightly less at T1, which gives you more at T2 or whatever, but it just gives you that guide. It's very important, I think, to set a realistic yield potential. We all want to grow 12 tonnes, and I'm sure when everybody goes down the pub tonight, we've all grown 12 tonnes last year. But realistically, I didn't, and I don't think a lot of us do. So if you've got a crop that's your averages are only at 8 tonnes, there's no point in putting a big spend onto fungicides. It's just going to be wasted. And this all goes through to the quality. What market are you growing for? If you're growing milling wheats, you're going to have a different strategy, spending more a bit later on to protect the quality, rather than if you're growing feed varieties. But only yourself and the agronomist will really know that. So you've got to be honest with yourself. I've mentioned it briefly before. Sprayer capacity is very important. It can become very pressured through the season. There's a lot of things that need doing, a lot of crops that need spraying. And it's not just the spraying. A lot of us have got cows to calve, sheep to lamb, potatoes to plant, whatever else it might be. Every farm is different. So are you certain of hitting your timings? There's no use setting up a 4-spray strategy if you're not going to have the capacity to do that. You might need to look at things like engaging with a contractor, and now's the time to do it so they know they've got the work ahead. Adapt the spray plans. It might be you go for a 3-spray strategy that fits your sprayers, spending more at a T1 to cover those sprays or whatever. But it's just having those discussions early on so as you can put a plan into place. Weather. We don't know what the weather's going to do. Nobody can predict for the season. They can barely predict what's happening tomorrow. But build in some flexibility into any plans that you're making. If it's dry, you'll have a completely different disease profile to if it's wet. The rust and Septoria like different sorts of conditions, so build it in. It allows you to adapt budgets to be able to, if you have got a very wet April, to put a little bit more money into your T1 sprays. If it's dry, you can maybe save some, but build some resilience into it. I think we've all got a duty to try and help with resistance management. A lot of people go on about it, but we've got fewer and fewer active ingredients, and that's only going to get worse whether we're in Europe or out of Europe. They're getting fewer and fewer, and their efficacy is getting less. We're sort of been using products poorly, relying on the strobilurins years ago, and we soon lost those after about 3 years. So we need to protect what we have with some good strategy, mixing of active ingredients, and I think we've all got to be able to do our bit with that. Following on from that, you need to have a discussion as where the position of chlorthalonil, the most widely used multisite that we have. It should, as the letter of the guidelines say, only be used twice. You should only put on 2 applications. There are ways to get around the rules, as a lot of people do, but what is the best position in your fungicide strategy for that? Should it be T0, T1, T2, T1, T2? Where's it suitable? And are the other multisites suitable for inclusion? I do believe that we can still grow higher risk varieties, but you very much need to be on top of everything. You need to be on top of your game, and you probably need to be prepared to spend a little bit more. And I'd only recommend this if the end market, people who are going to purchase your grain, want that variety. They're willing to pay up for that extra spend that you're going to have to do. Perhaps strangely, I always start my spray plans with T2 timings. This timing, I feel, gives the most consistent response. As Jonathan's already explained, that is where in the canopy the yield comes from. It comes from your flag leaf and the ear, and a little down, then down onto leaf 2. So it's the most important timing, I feel. So I feel it's very important, and it's also very predictable when it is. It's governed by day length. For us here, it's around about May 19th. Down south, it's a little bit earlier. Up north, it's later. You and your agronomist will know when that average date is, and it's normally within a 5-6 day period that you've got. And from there, you can work out your other spray timings, working backwards and forwards. You still do need to crop walk. You still just can't do it by calendar date. You'll still need to get out and have a little wander around with the dog and see exactly where that flag leaf is and all the other spray timings. The reason timings is so important is that whatever product you use, if you go more than 3 weeks, they all start to struggle. If you are looking to use it SDHIs, this is the most critical timing. So this would be where, if you're only going to use one, I would suggest you are looking to use it. It's the most appropriate time. You've got the most gain from both disease control and the crop physiology benefits that you get with using an SDHI. I believe the newest SDHIs do add, especially in high disease pressure situations. We're using the best chemistry when the real pressure's on. But I do feel to try and protect these that we must be mixed with a triazole mixing partner. We've got to try and protect these SDHIs. That's all that's coming through. So it's vital that we try and get as much out of them as we can. And I think the triazoles, there's been quite a bit in the press that they're not particularly doing much. But if you look at the ADAS yield response curves and what have you, they're still providing some good coverage, especially in a protectant situation. And in low disease years, I think don't discount non-SDHI options. Don't always go for that. If the disease risk isn't there, then go for a lower risk option. Go for a triazole with a multisite. Moving on to multisites, there's a lot of discussion about whether to add these at T2s. And it very much comes down to what product you're using. Different chemical companies have different advice, and they're normally based on some research and well-balanced research. So listen to those. And it also depends on what you've used before. If you've used 2-chlorthalonils, you might have to look at a different multisite, or you might have saved it for that situation. But I'd say the key is whether you're in a curative or a protectant situation. If it's curative, the Bravos of this world are pretty poor. They're not into curative actions, and it's almost the horse has bolted. In protectant situations, they're excellent. They've got a lot to do.
I think Richard's got
I'm going to interrupt again. We've got a few questions coming in. I'm just going to pick out 2. If there's any that we don't cover now, we'll go back to at the end. First one is, can you measure the accuracy of the sprayer to hit the spray target?
There's a lot of research being done into nozzles and the best nozzles to use. I would say the biggest step before deciding on your exact nozzles is working out your spray timings. You get a bigger benefit, I would suggest, from having an accurate spray timing than having the perfect droplet size. Also, the SDHIs are a lot more mobile, and the triazoles around the plant than, say, a chlorthalonil of this world, which don't move around. So yes, that'll add another 1 or 2% to the performance of your product, but it's more key to have more spray days to get around and cover it and get your timings right.
I'm going to direct the next one at you, Jonathan. Please, could the point about matching yield target to fungicide spend be clarified? Surely disease doesn't discriminate against a 8-ton crop or a 12-ton crop. Any comments?
Yeah, I mean, matching yield target to spend, it's always a difficult one, this, because we're often not in a position to judge what yield we will get at point of spend. But clearly, if you are in a situation where your yield is likely to be less than average, or in some way your crop is compromised, maybe a second wheat, for example, where you know you have take-all, or a situation where the crop is suboptimal in some way, then clearly cutting back on your fungicide input is a logical step, because you won't get that same stretch in yield. That said, even in quite low yielding seasons, we sometimes see big responses to fungicides, and 2012 would be an example of that. Overall yields were reduced, but untreated yields were massively reduced. So you do still see yield benefits even in lower pressure seasons sometimes.
Thank you.
So yeah, just to carry on what Mark was talking about at T2, I mean, we spoke about 3 different groups, I guess, the multisites, the azoles, and the SDHIs. And I just wanted to pick up on their activity and just consider each in turn for a moment and what they bring. And this first chart just shows the azole activity and how it's changed over time. And clearly we're in a very different place, where the heady days of getting 80% to 90% control from our azoles is long gone. But what's actually quite reassuring is in the last 3 or 4 years, protectant activity seems to have broadly evened out, somewhere between 40 and 60% control. We're using a lot of other chemistry to control Septoria now. The SDHIs are in there. We're using multisites a lot, and it's possible we're not selecting for insensitivity quite as fast as we were. And yeah, I think it's reasonable to presume we're not pushing that population as hard as we used to, and we seem to have a degree of stabilization occur there. And the same goes for curative activity. It's a very tough test, the FP trials, and there's always some level of disease within these trials that's beyond the control. But even in these tough tests, we're still getting 20 to 40% control from an azole at full dose in a curative situation. And that, as Mark said, is very useful activity to be including within our programs, and is very important. I will just touch on one thing Mark said about multisites. And I think, yes, there is undoubtedly some degree of antagonism that can occur from using multisites, especially chlorothalonil. And I think we've got to be careful of reading too much into that, because we often see a small negative as we see the chlorothalonil have affect the speed of uptake of that chemistry or block it in some way. But that's often followed, especially if conditions are wet through June, by a large positive. So the small negative is often outweighed by that large positive, and we often see. So I actually think that the multisites are a very important part of T1 and T2 strategies. When it comes to comparing the different multisites, I mean, there are 3 out there. I think we're wrong to actually consider them to be the same mode of action. They're not. They're all they've all got their own modes of action, and more than one of them, working in many ways. Chlorothalonil, though, dose for dose. I mean, this is just showing an individual trial we did a few years ago, where we compared dose rates of products over a standard program, and clearly chlorothalonil, in most of the comparisons we've done of this type, comes out very, very well. And the other 2 multisites, Folpet and Manzate, or Folpan and Mancozeb, clearly dose for dose not quite as effective. I think the relative position of those can vary from one season to the next, or one trial to the next, but we would usually see chlorothalonil as a little bit more effective dose for dose. Not to say that the others don't have a role, and I think both Folpet and Mancozeb can have less antagonism, perhaps more activity on rusts, so may have a bit more of a role to play in those circumstances. What we are seeing, though, and I think what's probably the most concerning, is a change in the efficacy of the SDHIs. And Mark touched on it from a resistance management point of view, that we need to be protecting these newer groups. I actually think we've probably been doing quite a good job of protecting them in the last 3 or 4 years, because I think we're in quite a different place to where we were in the early noughties, where we had strobilurins. And at that point, people were using strobilurins on their own, often in repeat programs. And that was quite an irresponsible approach. It exposed them to resistance. I actually think we might have seen this development of resistance to SDHIs much sooner had we not been using them in mixtures with multisites and with azoles. And we've probably responsible for seeing a slower decline than we might otherwise have seen. But nonetheless, we are seeing a decline. This is Vertizan, but I think it's a very similar pattern. I know it's a very similar pattern for Imtrex, and we would expect to see the same pattern across all of the SDHIs. I'm not singling out Vertizan in that respect. We do think that there's an increasing proportion of the Septoria population out there that's becoming less sensitive to SDHIs. We think entering this coming season, it could be between 20 and 40 or 50% of the Septoria population that is in that bracket of being less sensitive. Now, exactly what level of field performance we get from each of the SDHIs might depend on how inherently active they are. It might be the very best of them are less affected than those that aren't quite so strong. We're yet to see that, and it'll be interesting to see how that pans out as we go through the season. But I think that reduction in efficacy that we're seeing from the SDHIs makes me think that actually using the multisites and azoles in there at T2 is perhaps more important than it ever was before. I think programs that didn't use multisites at T2 were probably reliant more on that activity from that SDHI, and perhaps now that the SDHIs aren't doing as much, we may see more from the multisites. I wanted to draw out something that Mark mentioned a moment or two ago, actually, regarding how frequently we use SDHIs, because actually, the more we use them, the quicker we will lose them. It's a clear selection for insensitivity going on at the moment. And you could see it that we have a sort of a finite number of SDHIs that we can use in our crops before they become less valuable to us, or of no value even. And I think we're a little bit guilty sometimes of over-applying. All of the research that's done, or nearly all of the research that's done in the UK, focuses on highly susceptible varieties tested and testing of products on those varieties in high pressure situations. We do a lot of it over here in Herefordshire, comparing products, and we look at how they perform, and we always pull out the trials where we see the biggest differences, the most susceptibles, the highest pressure situations. But actually, that's not what people are doing. A lot of wheat crops are grown further east and under lower pressure situations, sown later, or on more resistant varieties. And it's in those circumstances that there's bigger questions to answer regarding our SDHI use. And I do think we've got to be careful we don't end up using belt and braces and some in terms of our resistant management strategies, because by applying them where we don't need them, we're just driving resistance faster. We're accelerating into the car crash, if you like. So I just wanted to touch on a couple of pieces of work we've done in the last 3 or 4 years that have tried to tease out how varieties might differ in their requirement for fungicides. So this is the first one, is a CRD, HSE, AHDB, and a whole host of other funders got involved with this integrated disease management project. And the part I want to draw your attention to really is the details of what we did within this. And we had 3 varieties differing in their susceptibility to Septoria, also around that early October sowing date on average. And we had 14 sites over the 3 seasons. And on those 3 varieties, we had 4 fungicide programs, varying from nothing through a low input strategy, a moderate input strategy, and a high input strategy. And the main difference between the low, moderate, and high is the addition of the SDHI. There's 1 or 2 extra azoles in there in the moderate and high as well. But the SDHI component, the low has none, the moderate has 1, and the high has 2. And what I was going to touch on was the yield differences that we saw on average in each season across the 3 varieties. So on the left-hand side here, you've got the most susceptible variety in 2014. Conqueror was the most susceptible, Cubanita was our intermediate, and Crusoe the most resistant to Septoria. 2014 was actually one of the higher pressure seasons. We had a nice spread of seasons, actually, had a good range. And in 2014, very clear that you can see there's been a real nice progression in Conqueror from the untreated at around 7 tons. Simply putting that low input strategy on, raised that by about 3 tons to about 10. Another ton from adding 1 SDHI, and about another 0.3 of a ton from adding that second SDHI in there at T1. Cubanita, slightly more resistant variety, and unsurprisingly, the untreated yield's a bit larger, and the overall response to each of those stages is a little bit less. And that difference between that SDHI once or twice, that grey and yellow bar, was smaller, on average about 0.1 of a tonne. That's getting to the point of sort of level at which you'd have to question the economics of that. Crusoe, you really couldn't see a difference between that 1 or 2 SDHI treatment. There was a benefit from adding 1. There was no benefit from adding the second. And that was in a reasonably high pressure season, a season where Conqueror was providing, what, on average about 4.5 tonne yield response to treatment. 2015 was a lower pressure season, exactly the same trial. The varieties are slightly different along the bottom here, but the principle was identical. We changed the varieties to better reflect what was being grown that season. And in that lower pressure season, it was interesting. We saw a benefit from the 1 SDHI strategy, but you really would struggle to separate the grey and yellow bars here, where we had 1 or 2 SDHIs. It really was within experimental noise as to whether or not one was better than the other. And I think overall, you'd have said there was no benefit from a second SDHI in that lower pressure season. 2016, more of an average season. And the responses are probably a little bit closer to what we saw in 2014. A good response to 2 SDHIs on the most susceptible variety gland. Zulu actually did respond a bit to 2 SDHIs, about a quarter of a tonne additional. But notice again, Cougar, no benefit from that 2 SDHI program. You should note the benefit from no SDHI to 1 SDHI here. If we go back, there was actually an azole included within that moderate input strategy that wasn't in there in the low. So it's not a clear-cut comparison. But I think what that neatly shows is on the more resistant variety, we really weren't seeing a benefit from adding that second SDHI across any of those seasons. We've got another piece of work that started more recently, and it's currently in its 3rd year of 3. So we have 2 seasons of data, and this is looking at agronomic factors affecting the development of Septoria and how agronomic factors might interact with what chemistry we use. And we're looking at various things within this, including varieties in much the same way as we discussed in the previous project, but we're also looking at sowing date and seed rate, as well as 4 fungicide treatments. And the fungicide treatments are a little bit different, but just to qualify that, I'm not going to talk about seed rate tonight because actually the effects are quite subtle and not quite as clear-cut as what we're seeing with sowing date and with fungicide applications. The 4 fungicide applications we have here, a little bit different. They're a little bit more balanced, actually, I think, than in the previous work. We have the untreated, we have a low input that's based primarily on chlorothalonil twice. The medium builds entirely on that, and it's just the addition of a strong azole combination. Brutus is a metconazole epoxy conazole combination at quite high loadings. So it was the best of what we could get from an azole chlorothalonil combination. And then the high is that same combination with an SDHI twice. Imtrex as being a solo SDHI floxyperoxide at 1 litre and 1.5 litres at the T2. So quite big steps between them, but the same principle as what we saw. And we were testing this across 4 sites in the UK and 2 in Ireland. So mostly quite high pressure sites. We did have Terrington in there as a standard, as a lower input or a moderate pressure situation. What did we see? Well, what was quite interesting, actually, touching on sowing date, this is the same type of chart as we've just seen, but we're now looking at disease control. And on the left-hand side, you've got the early sown treatments. On the right, the later sown treatments. And you can immediately see there is more disease in the untreated across all the varieties that were sown early. As Mark said, that there is a higher pressure in those earlier sowings. And this was at mid-June. And to me, this actually says, if that's the average and we're seeing a reduction or a less disease pressure in mid-June, well, that's roughly 1 latent period after our T2 application. It does suggest that our earlier applications in to our wheat crop may be under less pressure where we're sowing a little later. And so possibly that T1 treatment isn't under as much pressure where we sow in mid-October or beyond. I think that's something that we should need to take into account. We look a little bit later, and this is in early July on average, and yeah, the untreated yields have all caught up. But within the treatments, there still are some differences, and I think most marked is revelation, where here we're not seeing huge benefits from the grey to the yellow bars, either early or late. So we're not seeing a benefit from adding the SDHI in Revelation over that strong azole chlorothalonil combination, either sown early or late. And when sown late, to be honest, you're struggling to pull apart any of the treatments. I should add, within this trial, we did apply treatments to control rust, so that we were just looking at Septoria and we were taking rusts out of the equation. So that is a factor within there. We wouldn't actually recommend that people apply that low input strategy of just chlorothalonil, because it might do enough on Septoria in some circumstances, but it certainly won't do enough on rusts. Looking at the yield responses from that, and they're very similar to what we showed for the other work, actually. Clearly, on the left-hand side, where you sow Santiago early across the 9 sites where we got good yield data out of these trials, clear benefit from going to an SDHI-based program with Santiago. A little bit less clear cut with Diego, actually. We're actually able to get quite good control from the azole chlorothalonil mix, strong azole chlorothalonil mix there, either sown early or late. What was interesting, though, with Revelation, either early sown or late sown, we weren't really seeing much of a benefit from the SDHIs at all in the last 2 seasons. Now, you might say they haven't been the highest pressure seasons for Septoria, but it's quite interesting to me that, especially that later sown situation, we should start questioning whether we actually need SDHIs at all on those late sown resistant varieties. We've got Revelation here, but there's a whole host of others like Graham, Sundance, for example, that are really quite less susceptible to Septoria. They're not going to get the same amount of disease, and cutting back on SDHI use may be good from a cost perspective, but also from a selection for insensitivity perspective as well.
I was going to interrupt there. Got quite a few questions coming in, actually, and we're going to have to address most of these at the end. I think we're going to run over slightly. Got one from Anthony Wade here, so watch out. Hi, Anthony. He says, all very good at the time, all very good, but at the time of spraying or recommendation, you can't predict if it's going to be a low, moderate, high disease year. It can soon change if 2 weeks of rain after spray timing. Yeah. So it's cutting back a huge gamble.
Sorry, did you want to say that?
I would just say, in protecting situations, there's a lot more products which have more capability. Your multisites will add an awful lot more in a protecting situation. So if you've had dry weather running up to it, you've got very little disease, there are opportunities to cut back. We did a little bit of that last year, and we were quite lucky or whatever that it worked, and there wasn't significant amounts of disease. If the disease is there, even if it's in a latent phase, you need something a bit stronger, and you need to spend more money on it, I would say.
No, it's a fair point. Yeah, no, it's a good question, and I think what this all comes down to is what level of risk management are we applying on a variety like Sundance or Graham or Revelation when we apply one SDHI? Is that already belt and braces? And I think some of the information we're seeing across the different seasons, especially where we've looked at this comparison in high pressure situations, might suggest that even one SDHI is belt and braces on those varieties. So we're not actually taking a risk. We are actually allowing for the conditions to change and create a higher pressure season following that spray application. But I do take entirely on board what Mark says about protectants.
But I do sort of think that agronomists have a nightmare of a job. To not engaging with the farmers. They've got to treat for everything, because they'll get the backsides kicked if suddenly there's some Septoria there or whatever. If there's a good working relationship between farmer and grower, and there's an understanding of, okay, we're going to try and reduce costs, it makes it a lot simpler. I wouldn't want to be an agronomist for all the tea in China, because it's there's no thanks there at all.
Yeah. I've got one blamed for not doing something, can you?
I've got one other quick question for you, Jonathan. Very simple. Were there significant differences between the sites? Do you know?
There were some differences, but it was remarkably. I mean, yes, there was some variation, undoubtedly, and that's something we'll be looking to draw out, especially in the more recent work. But the overall pattern was very similar, actually, and I don't think it's a huge factor within that.
Excellent.
So, continue on a little bit further. Just to summarise on that, though, just to say, the resistant varieties from that first trial, no yield improvement over one SDHI. In the second trial, it was no yield improvement from the inclusion of SDHIs at all. So in terms of that sort of risk management, the data suggests in a range of seasons, we're struggling to see a benefit of that 2 SDHI program on those most resistant varieties at all. So I think that could be the starting point for our programs, and yes, we could adjust if we felt that it was an exceptional season, but that might be a better starting point. So just to top up on what Mark's already said about T2s, I mean, I concur with most of what Mark said, but I think actually I do think multi-sites are an important part of that T2 strategy, and probably a more important part than they have been previously. I think we've been able to rely on the activity of the SDHIs, and I think we probably shouldn't rely on them as much if we can offset a little of that by including multi-sites at that timing. I think that's a good thing to do. Looking at T1s though, and I think this is where changes might be appropriate, where people are growing more resistant varieties and sowing later. The triazoles, multi-sites and mildewicides, they're the sort of groups that we need to be using and starting with at this point. Mildewicides obviously only where crops are late sown or particularly susceptible. We also need to think about making sure we do control Septoria, and I think where pressure is higher, there is a case for using SDHIs, as we've clearly shown, in those higher risk situations and more susceptible varieties particularly so. There's a case for using strobilurins if we need to top up our yellow rust activity within there. An eye spot at T1 is also an issue, and boscalid or prothioconazole included at that timing, probably the most effective ways of keeping that in check.
Just moving on to T1 options, I fully agree with what Jonathan was saying, but out of his graphs, I do take out the big differences that varieties can cause and the drilling dates. I see that as absolutely key to making any decisions, and it does give you the opportunity to challenge what you're doing. Again, I'd aim for that 3 weeks before T2. We've got a crop walk when leaf 3 is fully out. If leaf 2 is just starting to show, it doesn't matter, but that's the critical time, not extending it beyond 3 weeks, because that just allows the disease to come in. Products run out of steam, as we've already said. Perhaps I'm a bit naive, but I think T1.5s are only really needed where yellow rust is out of control, or you've got your timings wrong. If you've gone too early with your T1, I think you'll need to top up control with the T1.5, but well-timed T0s, T1s, T2s, you won't need that T1.5 timing.
I concur completely on that, Mark. I think you're spot on.
Product choice. There's loads of products out there. Jonathan's already put up the different products, but I think there is a real chance at T1 to challenge yourself with your variety using all those cultural factors that we've described already. Variety, what disease is present, what you're expecting, what the weather is. Did you apply a T0? Are your timings right? All those sorts of things that we've used. We did it ourselves last year. We went on 2 of our varieties last year with Firefly, sorry, I shouldn't have mentioned products, a strobilurin triazole mix with a multi-site as well, and got some very good results. But where we had a bit more disease, we challenged ourselves and put it on an SDHI, rightly or wrongly. This is a chance, has already been covered, cover those non-Septoria diseases, keep on top of those rusts. If you're on top of the rust, you then haven't got to go with T1.5s. It makes your T2 sprays a lot simpler. You're only going after one disease, so you can put the maximum spend onto that Septoria, which is the big T2 disease. I think that SDHIs only pay in high pressure situations. If you've got a weaker variety, very early drilling, they've got a lot of disease on the crop, it only really pays in those sorts of conditions. That's backed up with what Jonathan said. If your times are stretched because of windy days, you have a windy week or whatever, increase the rate slightly or use a better product. If you're planning to go with a triazole and you're suddenly a week, 10 days late going on with your T1, maybe consider an SDHI, but always look to increase what you're doing. Multi-sites are, I think, are very important. You're in a protecting situation, protecting that new growth coming out, so it's very important. And start spraying with your higher risk crops first. Likes of Graham, your Revelation will buy you a bit of time. They will stand a few more days if you can't quite get it all round absolutely perfectly, but do your high risk crops first.
Yeah, I think getting that timing right on those high-risk crops is absolutely essential. You need to be waiting for that for leaf 3 to be out, and then making sure you hit that effectively. And you're right, if you are a bit late on the others, doesn't matter in the same way. Doesn't affect your overall level of control as much. That just relieves us really to cover the other two timings in the 5 minutes or so we have left, T0 and T3. I'm going to say a little bit about T0. I mean, I see this primarily as about rust control. Where we have yellow rust coming in, or brown rust in some circumstances where we have early brown rust develop, keeping on top of that early timing can make a difference and can help stop it spreading onto those yield affecting leaves. Eye spot actually is usually best controlled around growth stage 31, which isn't usually a timing which we target. That's somewhere between that T0 and T1 timing, but actually if you have got a severe eye spot circumstance or situation, it seems a bit heavy-handed to start waving prothioconazole or bosclid in there at T0. But if you are dealing with the wrong variety and the wrong scenario, or the right scenario for eye spot, then yeah, that can be a way of helping to keep that in check. We always used to talk about split treatments, and that's prochloraz or cyprodinil or something like that. Cyprodinil, I don't think there's anything active. It's not actually an active we can use in wheat anymore, but something that split timing was always a way of controlling it. On Septoria, I don't actually think we need to control Septoria at T0. There's possibly a case on the most prone varieties and those early sown, but I'll come on to that in a moment. And I think powdery mildew is quite a good time to control that, where you're sowing or growing varieties like leads, and especially later sown varieties seem to be more affected in the spring. But I do think on Septoria, there's quite a bit of information out there that suggests actually if Septoria is what you're primarily worried about, you don't need to worry about it at T0. But this is some work from Chuggas actually between 2012 and 2014, where they looked at a standard program on the left-hand side. And it wasn't, I mean, for them, this wasn't exceptional. They didn't have an SDHI at T1. They had quite a high azole dose. That's actually Proline 250 rather than 275. So that's a full dose of Proline. But they then looked at adding a T0, and they added various different T0s. Bravo, Rubric, which is straight epoxyconazole, Rubric plus Bravo. Gleam is the same as Brutus. It's a metconazole epoxy mix, and Gleam plus Bravo. And over the 3 seasons, you'd struggle to separate the no T0 treatment from any of the different T0s in terms of overall yield. And this is in Ireland, where Septoria pressure is generally considerably higher than what we see here. If they're not seeing a benefit over there, the chances of us seeing a yield benefit from that T0 purely on Septoria are pretty slim, I would say. So I think the case for the T0 Septoria is quite weak, actually.
I would just add to the T0 thoughts. If you are going to go for a T0, the temptation for us all is to get on because it's spring and we need to get going and we've been sat around for too long. It's to go too early. So I'd say be patient. If you go too early, you stretch that timing into T1 and you'll lose any benefit, whether it's rust, Septoria, whatever you're aiming. If you go too early, it puts too much pressure on the important sprays to come. The only one thing I would say about T0 and Septoria is it can give you greater flexibility. If you think you're going to be under pressure at your T1 timing, it can just a bit of an insurance policy. If you're going through the growth regulator, CTL was just over £4 last year, a little bit more expensive this year, but it can buy you that little bit more insurance and it could be worth considering. Finally, on to T3. We'll just run through this nice and quickly for you. Main targets, top up Septoria control and also Fusarium, especially if it becomes wet. For milling wheat, Fusarium control for me is an absolute must. With the mycotoxin regulations and everything else that's coming in, you don't want to have done everything right and then have a failure on mycotoxins. So targeting Fusarium is important in the milling wheat situation. Timing Fusarium is absolutely critical. Early to mid flowering. If you miss that timing, forget it. Just don't even bother. Keep it in the can and save yourself some money. Once you've got Fusarium in the crop, you won't cure it. It's a protectant sort of situation. So you've got to be out there looking for when that crop's starting to flower. Brown rust can also be a headache in susceptible areas, or if you haven't targeted it hard enough in the earlier spray timings. So you might not need to do a top up on that. If you've got brown rust at this stage, it can be a real yield robber. Can be a very simple spray based on triazole with plus or minus a strobilurin for rust control. So it could be a nice simple spray. And I would challenge you to use the potential to adjust the spend. If you've got a dry couple of weeks, the crop's losing its potential, you're on light land, you can cut back if there's not so much disease there. If there's lots of potential or there's a lot of disease there, it's very wet, you can up the spend. You've done everything right up to that point, so you might want to be looking after it. You might consider it's worth spending that. You know the potential of the crops, so you can think it's worth spending a little bit more.
Yeah, I was just going to add to that on regarding T3s. I think the one thing I would add is I think multisites may have a role, perhaps a larger role than they did previously. We have seen over the last 15 years, as we mentioned earlier, a drop-off in the activity of the azoles, and we've always seen them as helping to top up Septoria control at T3, but I don't think they probably are topping up Septoria control at T3 like they used to. And the multisites may actually add at that time, and I think probably concerns about antagonism of chlorothalonil with brown rust control or fusarium have put people off in the past, perhaps a little, but I think probably the benefits from chlorothalonil outweigh the downside. There is also the option of using, because there are limited numbers of treatments of chlorothalonil we can use, mancozeb or folpet at that timing may have a role, and certainly either of those probably won't negatively affect the azole activity on rusts, and actually mancozeb has been shown to have a bit of fusarium activity of its own, so using something like that at that timing might give us that top-up Septoria control that we're not now getting from the azoles.
Excellent, thank you both. Next slide. That takes us on to our questions and answers session. We've hit the 8 o'clock mark, but I'm going to try and power through some of these in quite an aggressive manner. If there's anything, I just want to point out, if there's anything, questions here you don't feel are answered sufficiently, or you've got any further questions, you will have my contact details from the invite. Please feel free to let me know, and I can pass them on to our speakers and get their thoughts and opinions. First one's from Andrew Goodinson in Herefordshire. In between writing abuse on the comments board, he asked the question: can you comment on the use of triazoles at T0 for Septoria control? Do you think they are needed?
Triazoles at T0 for Septoria control? I would say no. I don't think we need to control Septoria with triazoles at that time. I think the reason for including a triazole that early in a program would be for rust control. And that's where we'll see the biggest benefit from it. And the only exception to that might be perhaps where you're dealing with exceptional high spot circumstance where you think something like prothioconazole will help. But I really don't think there's a huge case for using azoles that early. We may select for greater insensitivity to our azoles later in the season by doing that.
I would suggest save your money for later in the program. It'll have more effect spending that money, unless you're trying to line the pocket of the agronomist of the year.
I'm going straight on to the next question there then. David Bell up in Scotland. Hello, David. Following on from resistance management, what steps are being taken to avoid the situation in Southern Ireland where there is resistance to fungicides, wheat is no longer a viable crop, reduction of reliance on chemicals, or more integrated pest management?
Well, I think the steps that we're taking are exactly the ones we've been taking. I don't think the resistance management messages have changed at all. Using our SDHIs only where we need them means that we're not using them and selecting for insensitivity unnecessarily. We do still need, the only way we can not select for insensitivity to SDHIs is to not use them. So, and that clearly would be hugely disadvantageous from an efficacy perspective. So using them where we need them and using other chemistry to control the disease as much as possible is beneficial, and the multisites probably at least risk of any resistance development. So loading them in their robust rates has got to be sensible. Azoles, yeah, there may be some selection for further insensitivity to them. So their use, yes, I guess there's a toss-up as to which you want to select for greater insensitivity to, but I think the SDHIs at the moment are moving faster. So using azoles and multisites predominantly and using the SDHIs where we need them is the way forward.
I do think farmers are getting a greater understanding of the effective variety. The graphs you were showing earlier, Jonathan, with variety, drilling date, it all comes into it, and there's a lot more awareness of that than ever there was, and all the publicity about losing actives and everything else, people are becoming more aware of other ways of solving the problem.
Okay, carrying on resistance management, do tell me if I'm repeating anything that's been covered and I haven't noticed. Which is worse for resistance management? Don't use an SDHI at T1 and have a dirtier crop for the T2 to cure, or use an SDHI at T1 and have a protectant T2 situation?
It's that old chestnut about resistance versus efficacy and that balance. I mean, from a resistance management point of view, using an SDHI at T1 may make your T2 less effective, your SDHI at T2 less effective, a little less effective, in the same way that a lot of talk has come out of Ireland regarding selecting for greater insensitivity to azoles by using them early in the season. We're likely to see the same with SDHIs. I think, to my mind, the best way forward out of that is to try and get good efficacy from your T1 without SDHIs, if at all possible. And if you can't, then you perhaps are going to see a benefit from adding that SDHI in. But it is a difficult balance that between one and the other. I think if we can use strategies that don't include SDHIs at T1, we may get better control, a higher percentage control. But if our starting point is high and we have a lot more disease, then yes, we're probably going to end up in the same place as we would if we were applying 2 SDHIs.
Is there any way in most years that one SDHI is enough?
Yes.
That's a simple answer, isn't it? I think, yeah, no, undoubtedly on those more resistant varieties sown late, there's clear evidence to suggest we don't need to be using 2 SDHIs. It's a more difficult decision, I think, on those intermediate varieties, and that may depend more on the season.
I'd even say you could challenge yourself with a very resistant variety of any SDHIs in a low pressure season.
Yeah, no, I completely agree, and that's what the data would suggest. That might not be belt and braces enough for some people, but if that is probably technically correct.
I've got another one here from Anthony Wade. Would you advise alternating azoles like they do in Ireland?
I think the alternation of azoles, I think the use of the same azole all the way through the season is likely to select for insensitivity to that azole. But I think the speed of selection for insensitivity to the azoles has been quite slow, and I think probably the benefits are going to be quite small from doing that. That said, we are seeing across various different field sites now variation in which azole comes out on top. Sometimes it's metconazole, sometimes it's epoxy, sometimes it's protheo, and it does seem to vary from site to site and season to season. I think on balance, we would say epoxy and protheo seem to come out a little bit higher than the rest on average, but metconazole can look very good in there as well sometimes. And that may reflect the amount that those products have been used previously. I think, though, to try and predict which azole is going to work best in each circumstance is probably impossible.
Can strobs be used more than 2 times from a resistance point of view now? Not legal, but any technical reason not to?
I mean, technically, then that reason was brought in to slow the development of insensitivity to Septoria back in about 2003, I think. Yeah, no, I mean, technically, I don't think we're likely to see further selection for insensitivity to the QOIs, to the strobilurins. But yes, legally, we aren't able to do it. So it's kind of a moot point, really.
Excellent. I'm going to call this our last question of the evening, as we're already 10 minutes over schedule. Apologies for that. Leaf 3 may emerge way before the convenient week before flag leaf, the usual flag leaf timing. Is it better to treat the newly emerged leaf 3 and plan a T1.5, or up the rate of the planned T1 fungicide and maintain the 3-week or so interval?
Yeah, it's a tough question. I mean, certainly mild seasons can stretch or get us much closer to T3 earlier on. It's a difficult one to judge this, because I think sometimes where we have leaf 3, I think you've got to be very careful to make sure 50% of your tillers are at leaf 3 emerged, because it's very easy to look at the main stem and say, oh, well, we're there, but we're not always there. I think there is a case in those circumstances for using a T1.5. Ideally, not going too early with that T1 might be as good a strategy though, and making sure that perhaps a greater number than 50% of your tiller is at leaf 3 immersion, and keeping that gap a little tighter may be as good a strategy.
Excellent. Thank you very much. As mentioned, yeah, I'm going to draw it to a close there. Thank you, gents, for an excellent webinar. Judging by the amount of comments and questions that got coming through, you've really got everybody thinking and thought-provoking. Just before I close then, I would like to first of all thank Elena, who's my colleague from AHDB, who sets up this webinar and set us all going tonight. We're not the best with technology, so she's had to probably be punching a wall somewhere, but she's thank you, Elena, very much for having us. As I mentioned earlier, the recording will be on the YouTube website, and the next webinar is on the 27th of February. Anyway, thank you very much, both of you. It's been a pleasure. It's not been easy for you to take up time for the evening, and you we did yesterday. We were preparing. It's been a lot of effort in, and I think it showed in a really excellent interactive webinar. Thank you very much, and thank you all for tuning in. And see you in February. Thank you and goodbye.
Thank you.